The sun had barely kissed the horizon when the rider approached the dusty cabin, his horse's hooves sending small clouds of dirt swirling in the morning air. He wasn't a stranger to these parts, but the woman standing at the door of the ramshackle homestead hadn't expected anyone. Not today. Not after everything. She stared at the man, eyes narrowed, trying to place him. The faint smell of burning sagebrush lingered in the air, a sharp reminder of the fire that had claimed everything she once held dear. Behind her, the wind tugged at the frayed edges of her faded dress, but she didn't move. Didn't blink. The man's gaze shifted, scanning the lifeless landscape before returning to her, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. She didn't speak, and neither did he. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the empty plains. "Don't know you," she said, her voice rough, as if unused to the sound. She didn't need to say more. There was nothing more to say. Her family had left her here, like an old boot thrown out with the trash, abandoned and forgotten. They were dead now, victims of the fire that had taken everything. The man didn't respond at first. His hand hovered over the reins, the leather worn from years of use, but the grip was steady, unyielding. His eyes, cold blue, met hers once again. "I know," he said finally. His voice was low, but there was a hardness in it, something she recognized. "But that don't matter." She took a step back, her boots crunching softly against the dry earth. "What do you want?" The man shifted, leaning forward slightly in his saddle. "I don't want a thing from you. Least of all your trust." For a long moment, they just stood there, two souls in a broken world. The wind swept through the empty plains, sending the tumbleweeds spinning. She could feel the weight of her solitude, pressing in on her like the heat of the midday sun. Alone. Left to carry the ashes of the past, with no one but the memory of her family. He spoke again, the words slow but deliberate. "But I'll be your family. You need that, don't you?" The wind shifted, and she looked past him, to the distant hills that seemed so far away. Was he mocking her? Or was there something genuine in his voice? Something deep and rough, like the land itself? She felt her heartbeat quicken, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She didn't know what to make of him. Didn't know if she wanted to. But before she could say anything, she heard it. The sound of hooves. 3 riders, their silhouettes cutting through the dimming light, coming in fast. The man on the horse straightened, his eyes narrowing in a way that made her heart skip. "Trouble," he muttered, more to himself than to her. And with that, everything changed. The sound of the approaching riders grew louder, thundering through the barren landscape like a storm breaking over the dry plains. Dust swirled behind them, their horses kicking up the earth, sending plumes into the sky. The woman, her pulse hammering in her throat, turned her eyes back to the rancher. His posture had shifted, less of a stranger now, more of a man preparing for something. His hands didn't waver, but she saw his eyes scanning the terrain, calculating something she couldn't understand. "Get inside," he said, his voice sharp but calm, the same way a man might order a dog to sit. Now. Her feet felt like they were made of stone, as if the ground had swallowed her up. But there was something about the way his presence commanded the moment. He didn't look like the kind of man who took orders from anyone, least of all her. Still, the weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a pulse of hope flicker in her chest. "I'm not hiding," she said, her chin lifting stubbornly. He turned his head, fixing her with a glance that could have turned a man to stone. "You sure about that?" Before she could respond, the riders were almost upon them. The man's hand moved to his side, where a revolver sat in a holster. The woman could feel the tension in the air, the danger tightening its grip around them both. The riders slowed as they reached the cabin, pulling their horses to a stop with a sharp yank of the reins. The first man, a tall figure with a weathered face and a scar across his cheek, gave the rancher a look that was as cold as the mountains themselves. "We're looking for someone," the man said, his voice gravelly, as if he chewed on more than his fair share of dust. The rancher didn't flinch. His hand was still resting on the butt of his revolver, but his eyes never left the man. "And you think that someone's here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, but sharp as a razor. The tall man grinned, a dangerous smile that didn't reach his eyes. Might be. Got a little business with her family. Or what's left of 'em. The woman's heart skipped. She had no love for the people who had abandoned her, but she was still one of them, wasn't she? Still tied to the wreckage of their name. And now these men on horseback, searching for what? Revenge? Answers? The rancher took a step forward, his boots clicking against the dry earth. The tall man's eyes narrowed, and the tension between them thickened. She could feel it, as if the air itself had drawn tight like a bowstring, ready to snap at the slightest move. She ain't got a family anymore, the rancher said, his voice low, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. You'll be wasting your time if that's what you came for. A silence fell. The wind howled between them, and for a moment the world felt small. The woman's breath caught, unsure of the next move. Her eyes flickered from the rancher to the riders, then back to the man before her. They weren't just here for her, were they? They were here for something more. Something darker. The tall man eyed the rancher, a calculating look crossing his face. You're gonna regret that, cowboy. He glanced back at his companions, and they shared a quiet nod, before one of them, a shorter, stockier rider with a scarred jaw, reached for the rifle slung across his back. Before anything could escalate, the rancher made his move. He stepped sideways, putting himself between the woman and the approaching danger. His hand didn't leave his revolver. Turn around and ride off, he said, his voice a low growl that sent chills down her spine. The riders hesitated, clearly unsure whether to back off or to push. The seconds stretched long, tight as a drawn bow. She could feel the eyes of the men on her, and it felt like the world was waiting for her to make a choice, too. Then, without a word, the first rider's hand shot to his own pistol. The air exploded with tension. But it was the rancher who moved first. The sound of the gunshot rang out, loud and clean. The rider's hand froze mid-motion, his pistol never leaving its holster. His face went pale, and the other men froze as well. The rancher had fired into the dirt at the man's feet, not a warning shot, but a statement. The dust settled around the rider's boots. You don't want this fight, the rancher said quietly, his voice like gravel scraping against rock. The man with the scar on his cheek glared at him, his jaw clenching. This ain't over, he muttered under his breath. And just like that, the riders turned their horses around, kicking up the dust as they retreated. The woman could barely breathe, the air still thick with the gunpowder smell, the sharpness of fear. The rancher didn't move. His back was to her, his profile outlined against the fading light of the morning. She didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. The air felt colder now, the sky darkening in the wake of the rider's departure. The wind had picked up again, swirling dust and whispers through the dry, cracked earth. The rancher stood unmoving, his hand still near his revolver. He hadn't taken his eyes off the retreating riders, his jaw tight, his posture alert. The woman didn't know what to say. She felt a pit opening in her stomach, something hollow and empty. The rancher had saved her from whatever had been brewing with those men, but for what? A debt she didn't understand? Or was it something else entirely? She had no family left to speak of, and now this man, this stranger, had stepped in, offering something she wasn't sure she even wanted. Her eyes fell to his back, his weathered duster flapping slightly in the wind. For the first time, she wondered who he really was. What had brought him to this broken piece of land? Was it just chance? Or did he have his own reasons for staying here, just like her? Thank you, she said finally, the words coming out in a breathless rush. He didn't respond at first. His eyes were still fixed on the horizon, as though the riders could come back at any moment. You need to get inside, he said again, his voice calm but firm. It ain't over yet. Her chest tightened. What do you mean? They're gone. They'll be back, he said flatly. And next time, they won't leave without a fight. She watched him carefully, studying the way he spoke, the way his body seemed coiled and ready for whatever was coming. There was no fear in him, only that quiet, dangerous certainty. What did they want with me? She asked, her voice faltering. She hadn't known how to ask that before, but now it felt like the one question that could make sense of everything. The rancher didn't turn around. He finally pulled his hand away from his gun and slowly walked toward the porch. The woman didn't know if he was trying to avoid her gaze or if he simply didn't know how to answer her. Your family left a lot of enemies, he said, almost under his breath, as he reached for the door frame. More than you'd think. She felt a chill run down her spine. Enemies? She echoed, incredulous. For what? For what they did to me. A long pause passed before he responded, his voice distant, as though speaking to a ghost. What they did to a lot of folks. People don't forget that kind of thing. And when they go, their debts don't just disappear. She stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. I didn't ask for this. You didn't have to, he said softly. The world don't wait for you to ask. It just keeps moving, dragging everyone along with it. A silence settled between them, heavy and unspoken. She looked at the door, then back at him, watching him settle into a stance that seemed both weary and resolute. She realized then, with sudden clarity, that he wasn't just here to protect her. He was here because he had his own reasons, his own ties to whatever was about to happen next. Before she could speak again, a sound broke the quiet, distant, but unmistakable. The steady thud of hooves. The rancher's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. They're back, he muttered. Get inside. The woman didn't need to be told twice. She backed toward the door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. She could hear them now, riding closer, the thunderous beat of hooves growing louder. There was no mistaking it. They weren't just riding for a confrontation. They were coming for blood. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, just as the rancher took his place in front of the cabin, his posture like that of a man who had seen too many fights and survived them all. His gun was out now, ready in his hand, his eyes locked on the horizon. The door creaked behind her, and for a moment she just stood there, her back pressed against the rough wood. She could feel the tension in the air, thick like smoke, her heart pounding as the sound of the riders grew closer still. Don't come out, the rancher called from outside, his voice low but clear. But she didn't want to listen. She wanted answers. She needed them. She couldn't just hide anymore. Not from what had been done to her, not from the man who had stepped into her life like a storm, not from the ghosts of her past. Just as she moved to push the door open again, she heard the unmistakable sound of men's voices, sharp and angry. They were almost on the doorstep now. The woman froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. And then, through the crack in the door, she saw them. 4 men, each one riding fast, their faces hard and determined. The lead rider's eyes flicked over to the cabin as he drew closer, his jaw tightening. Get out here, cowboy! One of them shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. We ain't finished yet. The rancher didn't flinch. He stood tall, steady, ready to face whatever came next. But the woman knew, this time, it wasn't just about family or revenge. This time, it was about survival. For both of them. The door was a flimsy barrier between the woman and the storm outside, but it felt like the only thing keeping her from the chaos that was coming. She heard the rancher's boots crunch against the earth as he moved closer to the riders, his voice steady but low as he spoke to them from just beyond her view. Y'all don't know when to quit, do you? His words were simple, almost bored, but the way he said them carried weight, like he had no patience for whatever game these men were playing. The woman's pulse raced as she pressed herself against the door, straining to hear every word. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin, but she couldn't tear herself away. Not yet. She couldn't stay locked away in this room while the world outside was unraveling. One of the men laughed, a short, harsh sound that grated on her nerves. You think we're just gonna ride off, cowboy? You're wrong. This little show's just getting started. She heard the clink of metal, the sound of guns being drawn. The tension outside was palpable, thick like the storm that had been brewing for days, only now it was ready to break. The rancher's voice was the only thing that kept her tethered to reality. Not today, he replied, quieter this time, but there was a finality in it. A promise. The woman swallowed hard, her fingers curling into the rough wood of the door frame. Her body trembled with fear, but something else stirred within her too. A raw, instinctive feeling she couldn't explain. She wanted to help, wanted to do something. Anything. But all she could do was watch from the shadows, as the world outside seemed to spiral toward a reckoning. In that moment, the door behind her creaked open slowly, and she spun around, startled. Her heart stopped for a beat. It was the rancher. He stepped inside the cabin, his presence filling the space like a storm moving over the plains. He didn't say anything at first. His face was hard, a quiet rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. The muscles in his jaw flexed as he glanced at her, his eyes flickering to the rifle leaning against the wall. "You know how to use one of those?" he asked, his voice gruff, but not unkind. There was a strange softness in the question, an unspoken offer. She hesitated, looking at the weapon. She had seen it before, her father's rifle, the one he had kept by the door, just in case. But that was years ago, and she hadn't thought about it since the fire. "I've shot a few times," she said quietly, though it felt like an understatement. She'd never been the best shot, but she had learned how to aim. To survive. The rancher studied her for a moment, as if weighing the truth in her words. Finally, he walked over to the rifle, picked it up, and handed it to her. The weight of it felt foreign in her hands, yet somehow familiar. It had been her father's, but it felt like it was meant for her now, like it belonged to her in a way she couldn't explain. "Keep it close," he said simply. His eyes didn't leave hers. "Don't hesitate." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the cabin was thick with silence. Outside, the riders were still waiting, their impatience rising like smoke. But inside, there was only the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall, and the weight of what had been said. She nodded, swallowing down the lump in her throat. He wasn't asking her to fight. He was asking her to stand beside him. To face whatever was coming. Her hands were steady now, no longer trembling as she adjusted the rifle. She had lost everything, but the rancher had offered her something she didn't know she needed, a choice. A chance to be more than the woman who had been left behind. Without another word, she moved toward the door. The rancher followed her, his steps slow and deliberate, as if they both knew what was at stake. As if this moment was the one thing that would decide everything. They stepped back into the daylight, the wind biting at their skin, the sound of the riders still just out of sight. And then there they were. 4 men on horseback, their faces set in grim lines. The woman's breath caught in her chest as the rancher stood at her side, the rifle cradled in her hands. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, but there was something else too. Something that had been buried deep inside her for so long. A sense of purpose. She wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. One of the riders, the tall man with the scar, narrowed his eyes at the pair of them standing side by side. "You think you can protect her?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think this is some kind of damn game?" The rancher didn't flinch. "It ain't a game. You just don't know how to play it." The woman stood there, the rifle resting lightly against her shoulder. She couldn't help but feel the shift inside her, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. The world had been broken for so long, but now, for the first time in what felt like years, she was ready to fight for something. To stand her ground. The rancher's voice was calm, but it carried an authority she hadn't expected. "We'll end this here. You walk away, or you don't walk at all." The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of their clothing. The riders hesitated, their eyes flicking between her and the rancher, weighing their options. The tension between them was like a coiled spring, ready to snap. And for the first time, she realized the truth: the storm wasn't just outside. It was inside her too. "Make your choice," the rancher said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. And then the silence stretched long, as the world waited for what would come next. The silence between them thickened, the wind carrying the distant, haunting sound of the plains. The 4 riders sat motionless, Their eyes locked on the rancher and the woman beside him, as if the weight of the moment could shift the very earth beneath them. The tension hung like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. "Make your choice," the rancher repeated, his voice steady but filled with the promise of danger. His eyes were cold, and every muscle in his body was taut, ready for whatever came next. The woman stood at his side, the rifle still resting against her shoulder. She hadn't fired it yet, but her fingers felt the cool metal of the trigger, the weight of responsibility settling into her bones. The tall man with the scarred face spat onto the dirt. "You're outnumbered, Cowba," he said, his voice low but edged with fury. "You don't have the stones to face us all." But the rancher didn't flinch. "You're not the first men to threaten me, and you won't be the last." The tall man jerked his horse forward, his hand moving to the gun at his hip, but before he could make another move, the woman stepped closer to the rancher. Her eyes were locked on the riders, but her focus was on the rancher, on the man who had stood beside her when no one else had. "Don't," she said quietly, her voice stronger than it had been before. She had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time, she felt like she had a say. She could make a choice, too. The rancher's eyes flicked to her, a brief moment of understanding passing between them. His lips twitched into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The wind whistled through the dry grass, a sound like a warning. "I'm not running," she said, her voice firm, as if it had always been this way. As if she had always been the one to make the decision. She raised the rifle, her hand steady now, a steady calm settling in her chest. She might have lost everything, but she hadn't lost herself. The tall man's face twisted with anger. "You'll regret this," he growled, his hand still hovering near his gun. But it wasn't his hand that moved first. It was the rancher's. The crack of the gunshot split the air, sharp and final. One of the riders, a lanky man with a crooked grin, slumped forward in his saddle, his body falling lifeless to the ground. The other three froze. The rancher's eyes never left the tall man's, the steady, cold resolve never wavering. He took a step forward, his boots digging into the earth, and the remaining three men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "You've lost," the rancher said simply. "I suggest you leave." For a long moment, the riders said nothing. Then, without a word, they turned their horses, the sound of hoofs pounding the earth as they rode off into the distance. They didn't look back. The wind settled, the air still thick with the aftermath of the standoff, but in that moment, it felt like the world exhaled, just for a second. The woman stood still, her heart still racing, the rifle now lowered to her side. She didn't know if she'd done the right thing, or if there had even been a right thing to do. But the rancher was standing beside her, and she wasn't alone anymore. He gave a short, sharp nod toward the cabin. "Come on," he said. "Let's get inside." As they walked back to the small house, the woman felt something shift within her. The house wasn't much. It wasn't home, not yet. But there was something in the way he'd stood beside her, in the way he had offered his protection without asking for anything in return. Something that made her realize that family didn't always have to come in the form of blood. She glanced at him as they reached the door, and for the first time, she saw the weariness in his eyes, the burden of someone who had been carrying too much for too long. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said softly, her voice quieter now. "But thank you." He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the doorframe. Then he looked at her, a small, almost imperceptible smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I didn't expect you to," he replied. And for the first time in a long while, the woman felt the faintest glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. Years later, she would remember that day, the way the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the plains. She would remember the way the rancher had stood beside her, his calm presence a shield against the storm that had threatened to tear them apart. She would remember the quiet strength in his eyes, the way he had never faltered, even when everything else seemed broken. And she would remember the day the riders left, not just for their lives, but for the life she was beginning to build again, a life she never thought she would have. The cabin, small and weathered, had become something more than a place to hide. It had become home. And the rancher, the man who had stepped into her life when no one